Right, I'd like to welcome Rohan Kapitany. If I pronounce that correctly, I think, well, I just asked you about a minute ago, so hopefully I did, but I still might have butchered it. And Rohan wrote a really, really interesting paper, co-authored. So it was a really cool paper that I read. It was from 2022. It's in Frontiers in Psychology. I'm definitely going to put a link to it because it's open access as well, which is one of the great things with that particular outlet. So anyone can go in and read it. And it's about pretensive shared reality and essentially adult pretend play. And one of the, I'm not going to tell you everything about it because obviously Rowan's here. But one of the things that is really interesting about it is it talks directly about tabletop role-playing games and how they are an example of the previously underestimated amount of time that adults might spend pretending, whereas previously the idea was that only kids did that stuff and adults would grow out of it. Why would they ever do that?
Mm.
So, but before we talk a bit about that, just because there are hardly any people in this space that you and I were just discussing a bit off camera,
Sure.
what got you interested in doing this? Because you've got psychology background,
Yeah.
there are hardly any people doing this kind of stuff from psychology. Why you? Why did you do this?
Well, there's two answers to that, the short one and the long one. You can edit as you see fit, but I guess the short one is the pandemic, like like everyone. I mean, yeah, in the short version, I was always a bit curious about D&D. I've always loved board games. And before the pandemic, I was starting to read the books, but I had barely had a chance to play. And I managed to cobble together maybe 2 or 3 sessions with friends and also with some strangers. And then, of course, the world changed. And I was playing regularly every week, perhaps during the pandemic, with a group of randoms that I met on meetup.com for my local region. I'd also just moved cities, so I had a new job and I didn't know anyone. And it was not the most exciting part of the world to be in either. So being a GM for a group of randos was really stabilizing, right? Kind of kept me sane, and I know it kept them sane. Um, and they the group assembled was a, a group of misfits. They were all wrestling with their own things. And it became clear, I won't reveal the specifics, but it became clear that a lot of them were processing major identities and experiences through the game. And it became really intense for a couple of years, for at least 2 years. And at that point, well, at the early part of the pandemic, I hadn't really seen it as, oh, this is something that is psychologically interesting. But it soon dawned on me through the observation of this gaming group, with no self-reflection at this point at all about what role it played for me, was like, oh no, this is doing important work to help them get through this time as well as to wrestle with their own stuff. And so it was then that I realized, oh, these silly games of imaginary make believe with dragons and volcanic islands made out of moonstone. No, this matters. It's doing something interesting, and that's when I started to try to incorporate it into my broader scholarly output. Which kind of, I guess, the longer version, I'll touch on it briefly, is understanding religion, understanding why we humans believe what we believe. Perhaps a religion is quite interesting to me, but the central question I've been wrestling with for the last 1 or 2 years is like, how do we know what is real? Um, and getting at religion is really challenging, ethically and practically. Um, Asking people about their wizard is not ethically or practically challenging, but it's all running on the same hardware and software. So um, there is some way to unify. There is some way to understand all of these constructs as a way to understand how humans understand what is real in the world.
So, what a couple of things strike me there. First one is it sounds like your game was a particularly, or your gaming group had a particularly profound experience. So, first of all, would you say that the TTRPG game that you played, the campaign that you played,
Mm.
resulted in a real terms change in the personalities of the people involved?
Uh, sorry, short answer is yes. Maybe not all of them, but to some degree, everyone was changed by the pandemic. But I guess I haven't revealed any specific information here. One of them kind of ended up transitioning, right? So, and this was something that they were really working through in the game. And that's something we ended up having conversations outside of the game about because I was a little bit older and a psychologist. So I had a little bit of that lab coat effect. They were comfortable talking to me about these things. And, I like them. I don't think I met them once in person, but that was enough for them to kind of go, oh, you're older, you're a psychologist, you're running this game, it's really important to me, can I tell you something? And it kind of ballooned out from there.
That's really interesting. And it speaks a lot to this idea that lots of scholars in RPGs are talking about in relation to how you can use RPGs to play with identity and experiment with things and
Mm,
see how they feel for you before
yeah.
you apply them in real life. Um, can I also ask, it sounds like your first RPG experiences therefore were relatively recent and you started as a games master.
Yeah, I'm a forever GM, and the more I've only played a little bit as players, but I like being a GM better. No one runs the game just the way I want to run it. Um, and I enjoy the world building. That's really what brings me to it. I like the paracosms, the world building, the putting problems in front of my friends these days, less so randoms, putting problems in front of my friends and just letting them riff on it. And as the GM, I also have a lot more influence on what games we play. So it's not just D&D. Started with D&D, but there's Apocalypse World, there's Triangle Agency, there's Fiasco. There's a range of other games to play with that really only the GM can facilitate. So
And I think I feel quite similarly to you, and this is probably a terrible thing to admit, but I like either being the GM or being a wizard of some description because it has to be intellectually complicated. I have to have lots of choices in front of me to enjoy the game. If I'm a fighter and I just have to hit something because that's what I'm best at, I tend not to get very involved. And I think there's a difference. I don't know what the difference is yet. I'd like to
yeah,
know between people who love to play more, people who love to DM more or
yeah, yeah,
only, and designers and world builders at the other level, your Tolkien's
sure,
obviously,
yeah.
and people like that.
Yeah, my experience, and this is not a professional one, just like when I play, I always end up playing utility. It doesn't, in fact, I don't want it to be complex because I can't always take the GM hat off. But seeing a GM, particularly if they're a little bit less experienced than me, like I can see where the lines in the story are. Like, oh, I see what you're doing, and so I play a utility character so that I can support the other character. So it kind of forces me to not be like, I can see what you're doing, and kind of act as a catalyst for my fellow players rather than, yeah.
Okay. Right. So to the research.
Mm.
So this paper about pretensive shared reality, and again, I'm going to put a link to that in the description. Um, if you were to summarize it, because is it fair to say that's your central work on RPGs to date?
It would be the foundational one. Yeah, that's where we set out all the initial ideas, some of which have changed a little bit, but I am still currently publishing and researching in the space
Okay.
as well.
Well, in that sense, then, what would you say is currently the main thing that you've learned about TTRPGs from a psychological perspective? Because that's what I'm interested in above all other things.
Yeah. What have we learned? So I guess, and maybe to answer the first part of the question directly, that we wrote that paper, we initially pitched it as part of the 50th anniversary edition for D&D. I spoke to Talia and Thomas. Talia is a scholar of theater studies. Thomas has a deep interest in religion, but he's also a LARPer and deep into TTRPGs. And we pitched something to that edition, and we were rejected. But we kind of had so many meetings, and we'd written the work, right? And we thought there is something here. And so being rejected was actually really positive because we're like, all right, let's polish it to the standards we would have if we wanted to submit it for peer review. Um, and kind of, you outlined its kind of central thesis before. We don't take seriously enough adults doing pretends play. It's really common. It just doesn't look like what children do. Children have less enduring, more effervescent, less structured pretends play. When adults pretend play, we sit down, maybe we're having fun, we're being silly, we're whatever. But we're sitting down, it's very structured. Even if it's just the D&D table, there's more rules. But then you could look at LARPing, way more structure, way more rules. Other kinds of pretend play, kink play, people who dress up in certain ways and pretend to be things they're not. Even the fellas, the macho fellas playing fantasy football and all of that, that's a form of pretend play. But because it doesn't look like little kids playing cops and robbers, we don't tend to take it seriously at face value. And I think there's also a prejudice in the psychological field, and I say like a lowercase p prejudice, that studying something like play in adults, because play is childlike, that the scholarship itself is childish. It's not as serious as other things like real prejudice studies, social psychology. So it's really underserved, and so that the primary emphasis in that paper was just like, we need to take this more seriously because it's everywhere. We need to take it seriously for its own sake. But in addition to that, it's a useful tool for understanding identity, for understanding basic cognition, for understanding interventions or social groups and things. I'm more on the basic end of the spectrum. Hey, this is a weird piece of cognition. And I've already said, like, I think there's some, give me 5 years and 2 million in grant money and I'll tell you how it relates to religion. But I do think there's some inevitable connection to be made there when scholarship on the topic becomes more mature. So I don't think there's any one finding there. It's more of like the advocacy that this is a serious thing we should consider more widely.
I've just made a note of the religion point because I definitely want to ask you that later on because that sounds really interesting and you're clearly the person to ask. So a question that I love the devil's advocate questions, which are hard questions, which I don't expect you to have the answer to.
Uh-huh.
And it's as follows. You talk about prejudice in the academic sphere, prejudice with a small p towards studying leisure.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
I remember Gary Allen Fine, who wrote a book in 1983 about D&D, and he's a sociologist. He said something along the lines of sociologists in the 70s and 80s thought that if you try and do an academic study of something fun, you're removing the point of it being fun in the first place. So there's another reason for maybe not studying these things. But I'm interested in why more adults don't do this. So
Mm.
there is a bit of a prejudice with a small p in society for adults who pretend
Mm.
stuff,
I
right?
think so.
They might be called nerds or geeks or something like that on the more benign end of the spectrum. And there is a majority of never gamers.
Mm.
This is an assumption I have. I would never touch D&D with a barge pole. Um, so the devil's advocate question is there something wrong or is there something right about adults who continue to pretend way beyond childhood?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing right. I mean, everything in moderation. The absurd, the reductio ad absurdum here is something like the satanic panic. You do this, and your mind will be corrupted, and you'll be unable to tell fantasy from reality. I mean, we know that humans are exceptionally good at differentiating fantasy from reality, no matter how hyperbolic it is. Um, I think it's like so many things. I'm not going to dwell on religion, but it's like saying, is it good or bad to be religious? Well, it depends what you're interested in. There are objectively things we can say about people in religious communities. When you measure it quantitatively, they're happier on average. They live longer on average. They take fewer risks. They have more social connections. But that doesn't mean someone who's not religious can't also be happy or can't also live long or whatever. So is there what's good or bad about playing TTRPGs or engaging in imaginative play? Yeah, I mean it's going to tick some boxes for some folks and make them feel good. Someone else probably is getting this more or less the same kick out of playing football or something. So I guess the uniqueness of imaginary games is that you are co-constructing this imaginary thing, whereas in football there's less abstraction, right? There's less communally held abstraction. So it's just yeah. Does that answer your question? Have I
It
got it
does.
what you were getting at?
No, it does. I suppose if I was to double down as a devil's advocate, and of course
Yeah,
I play these games, so
sure.
everything here is with a pinch of salt. Someone could point to football, for example, to take your example there,
Yeah.
and say, "Oh, football enhances your fitness, and it gets you out and about, and you won't have a heart attack as you won't be as likely to have a heart attack and all this kind of stuff later in life." What's the benefit, if there is one, of playing TTRPGs other than the fun that's experienced in the moment, or is there none, and we're actually just trying to think too hard about this?
Yeah, I think if I'm being really cautious, I'll give a cautious answer and then a more speculative one. I think by the standards of evidence that I want to see as a psychologist, it's really hard to point to definitive benefits to it. It's certainly the case that it's used in many contexts as interventions. I read your preprint about perspective expansion in people with ASD traits. There was a tie into that, or am I
Um,
misremembering?
that's another one which you might have received in another way, but it was the
Ah,
one that's a preprint currently is about perspective taking and how that's associated with an association between playing characters which are more different from
mm,
yourself and better self-reported perspective
yeah,
taking. But this is just within a group of gamers, so it's hard to call
yeah.
it a real advantage.
Yeah, and I think that's really getting at it. So there are some hints that things are happening. When we exercise our brain, when we routinely engage in certain kinds of cognition, we get better at them. Perspective taking, practicing for conflict or for dealing with intimacy, or making, there's intervention work for helping people um, remedy what they perceive or they feel are like deficits. If they're not good at social skills, you can pretend, and you'll develop them. Now, I don't read the clinical literature. I've read enough of it to know that it's out there, but it's often very small n. It's often with people who are seeking treatment. Where's the double blinds control? I don't know how you'd blind an imaginary game like this, but where's the control group? And even as you said, your work was among gamers. And I suspect it's because I don't think you or I have a lot of money funding to do this work. If we had more money, we could do more expansive work. So it seems really suggestive that stuff is definitely happening, but by the kind of standards of evidence and data, I I couldn't be more confident in kind of going, it's definitely happening. Not certainly not any more than reading a good book. You're exercising your mind in a certain way. There is something else happening there, but like, is it making more or a different impact from reading a good book? We just don't have the data. And so, when you asked me before about what are some of these findings, I've actually kind of retreated from almost trying to make findings to the question of measurement. Right? If you want to say this person experienced bleed between the character and the self, or permeation, which is a term I think I'm preferring in cognitive sciences. If we want to talk about perspective taking, we need validated measures. So at the moment, for the last 3 years, I've been focusing on how can we make a measure so that you and I can agree what we're talking about. Or if we don't agree, so that we can have a productive disagreement and go, you would say, Rowan, the second half of this is focused all wrong. You're confused about a certain thing, and then I can agree or disagree, and we can improve the tool, the measurement. So yeah, I don't have any findings except that we need more measurements so that we can get to the findings, so that we can get to agreement or disagreement.
I think it's an absolutely excellent point. And for anyone who hasn't done psychology research, what you would normally do, I think, in these circumstances, by all means, correct me if you're wrong. If you want to know the impact of TTRPGs on a player's psychology, you would get one group of people, give them a TTRPG and they've never played TTRPGs before, and give another group of people something very similar but doesn't involve a particular thing like role playing in a character very similar to yourself in one group and role playing a character very different from yourself in another group. You then hope against all hopes that each group would play a game which was broadly the same as the other group's game, which is highly, highly unlikely anyway in a TTRPG. And then you'd measure how the two groups came out at the end.
Hmm.
Now, this is relatively easy with things like exercise. You put some people on a treadmill, you take some people off. But with TTRPGs, which are already so messy,
Absolutely.
um, it's even if you have the money to pay someone to run the games for 4 or 5 people at a time over weeks and weeks to really ensure that you get a proper difference. you're still not going to have many people involved. You're still going to have very messy data, and your conclusions are always going to be quite tentative. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think very much so. And I mean, you've started at the really messy end of like, let's study the thing as the thing. Let's study a table with four players and a GM type structure. You can get better control if you just use vignettes, but then you're not looking at the thing as the thing. You're looking at an abstraction or a simplification. And that may have merit, that may not. But yeah, measurement, execution, there's more art in science than people realize, and trying to balance all this stuff is really hard. And so then if you're trying to draw firm conclusions that generalize, do TTRPGs do X? It's like, wow, where do we even start? So
Agreed. All right, so one more difficult question for you, and then I'd like to bring you back to that question of religion, which I hadn't prepared for, but I think this is going to be really interesting.
sure.
So you mentioned briefly this idea of never gamers. I don't know of anyone who's actually kind of done any research specifically on
Mm,
people who would never
yeah,
game or just find it somehow uncomfortable to do so or to
yeah.
pretend even as an adult. Um, and I don't expect you to have an answer to this because, again, I don't think anyone's really studied it directly. But given that you have studied pretense in
Mm.
adults, do you have any intuitions as to why some people say, "Yeah, I play D&D," and some people say, "What? Keep that stuff away from me."
Yeah. I think if we don't, my position is as follows, and I think it's useful to not talk about TTRPG here, right? It if I asked you the question, well, why do you think someone wouldn't go to a poetry slam? Why don't you go down to the local cafe on a Friday night that has the event and go into it? Partly it's going to be ignorance, but probably a bigger part of it is going to be, I guess, prejudice again, lowercase p prejudice. Like, oh, that's not for me. Poetry's for the beatniks and artsy types. I haven't been like that for 20 years. Um, when you say something like, do you want to play a game of D&D or a TTRPG, you get like the opposite of the Stranger Things effect, right? The people who have the prejudice that isn't that a stupid game for kids doing maths? Like, I don't want to. That's not how I want to spend Friday night. Um, and I kind of, so I think it's basically just expectations, and I think that's true because first of all, perhaps you've had this experience as well. If you get someone who's a bit reluctant to play, maybe a romantic partner, like my partner, who this was never on her radar. She thought it was a bit silly, but we were dating and still together. But when we were early on dating, she's like, he's into this, so we'll try it. And she's like, oh, this is great. I love this game. Like, she's super attached to her characters and the world and all of this. So it's just overcoming that expectation, that prejudice. I think the other thing is these games are social engagements. The Your first experience, your first GM, your first good GM, your first GM, and your first bad GM, you remember that, right? And if your first experience is a GM who maybe isn't even bad, but who's just clumsy or inexperienced or not giving you the kind of social experience you want, you could be down the cafe listening to a poetry reading instead, but you're here. That, I think, that can set a course, and that can be quite hard to turn around. So I don't think I struggle to imagine a human who's like, imagination is not for me. It's just the flavor of imagination, because your macho neighbor might be into fantasy football, but they're not going to play TTRPG because there's just like, that's just not for me, and I'm okay with that. They say I prefer to think about trading trading football players. I'm not a football man myself, so pardon any slips.
I'm the
So
worst kind. I'm a TTRPG fan and I love football.
yeah, okay.
I'm very, and I'm right-handed and left-footed. It makes no sense. Um, okay, that's really, thank you for that. So, religion. I'd
Mhm.
never really thought about TTRPGs in the space of religion. You clearly have.
Mhm.
Why should we think about TTRPGs in the space of religion or vice versa?
Yeah. Let me qualify a little bit, because there may be folks out there who are religious listening to this. I'm not drawing an equivalence in the moral weight or significance between what someone does in church or temple or synagogue or their mosque and what I do on a Thursday night, drinking some beer, talking about goblins. Um, the moral weight, the personal significance, socially, individually, not the same. But it's the same software and the same hardware doing both of these things, right? Like the superficial kind of cognitive similarities, they require, at least when we're thinking about big doctrinal religions, so religions, to put it most simply, that have kind of holy texts or doctrinal texts. Games have doctrinal texts. I can see several of them behind you right now. So there's a lot of memory for semantic details that are going to be relevant to you engaging with further information. We call it law. Religious folk call it doctrine. In both cases, we have to regard things that are beyond our immediate perceptual abilities, things we can't see, can't touch, can't feel. We have to represent them in dynamic ways. So, to be a little bit flippant, what would Jesus do and what would Gandalf do are the same question that the brain can process. Now, does it come to a different conclusion? Is one conclusion more weighty or morally informative than another? Almost certainly. But the brain is still answering a structurally similar question, and it's worth asking at that point, is it the same thing or is it something different? We also see in TTRPGs that it's probably the biggest difference is the co-construction. People don't really co-construct religion, but they do co-construct meaning within religion. And in TTRPGs, we co-construct a world, which may have meaning, it may not, depending on your table and various other things. But in both cases, we have to have an enduring sense of this other place, this other thing. And from Sunday to Sunday or from game session to game session, we can leave that representation and return to it. And it's still high fidelity, it's still there. And then again, we can dynamically wrestle with the goblins or with questions about good and evil. So superficially, a lot of things seem similar. They also have rituals. I guess if empirically, I've been thinking about rituals for more than a decade. Religions have rituals. I don't think I need to justify that claim, but like there are rituals and ritualistic behavior in tabletop role-playing games. Dice as a minimum example. I guess as a final point, because I'm not really a super expert on this, but there is an excellent book by Neil Van Leeuwen called Religion is Make-Believe. The subtitle, A Theory of Belief, Imagination, and Group Identity. It's good. I will say it's a little dry. It's a little more academically focused. So a dedicated non-academic could get through it, but they might struggle with the first couple of chapters, which are basically defining philosophical presumptions so the rest of the argument can follow. Now, I have no idea if Dr. Van Leeuwen plays TTRPGs, but he has given the hardest, most thorough account of the relationship between imagination and religion. And it's a very good book, but it is maybe a little bit hard work if you're not used to reading dense things like that. But that's an excellent, that's the strongest thesis on here's why these two things, we should at least examine these two things side by side, because there's probably equivalence in some domains, if not many.
If I was to try and drill down into this, where there is overlap between religion and TTRPGs and where there is not. Currently in my head, the idea I have now is there is a sort of, at a technical level, there is an overlap. So the way in which we process thoughts and ideas about your Gandalfs, your Jesus, whatever it might be. But a philosopher would probably say that there's going to be a big difference in the attribution of belief, right? So TTRPGs is about suspension of disbelief,
Yeah.
whereas what would Jesus do? That person thinking that, a religious person, would attribute a genuine belief to the existence of Jesus. And no one would for Gandalf. They would just have to suspend the disbelief that he's definitely not real in a moment to entertain that as a sort of counterfactual. So, am I right in thinking that maybe the overlap is more technical and less philosophical? Does that make sense?
More technical, less philosophical. Or the other way around, more philosophical and less technical. So if someone went back to the transcript here, I hope what I'm about to say is true. I try to avoid using the words real and belief, and also natural and supernatural. Um, because we're really, as cognitive scientists, we really don't know how we do it, right? There's some really good work coming out of some folks in London who, forgive me, I don't recall their names, but they're doing neuroimaging stuff. And I don't normally care much for neuroimaging stuff. It's not my expertise, and I don't always see the connection between voxels lighting up in an image, little brain regions lighting up, and kind of what people report when they say, I was at church, it was a transcendental experience. I was at a gaming table and it was like nothing you've ever seen before. But they're doing some really good work. And it kind of seems at the cognitive level, this idea of belief or real, or I try to use degrees of being certain or confident in something. It's just like a meta tag that we add to some information and then we kind of incorporate it as real, or our meta tag is like not real, and we then operate in our normal world. I think the best way that I try to illustrate this to like my students is go back 150 years. You don't even have to go back that far. You can go back earlier, but go back 150 years to the Royal Society when the first gentleman showed up with a stuffed platypus. And they're like, here's a monotreme. It lays eggs. It's a mammal, but it's poisonous and it lives in the water and it's got a duck's bill and et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, this is outrageous. This is not real. This is a hoax. Or if I asked someone who'd never been to Paris, describe the Eiffel Tower. Is the Eiffel Tower real? They go, of course. It's this tall. It looks like this. I've seen a million pictures. How do you know the Eiffel Tower is real or not? How do you know the platypus is a real, valid biological entity or something worthy of rejection, even when it's in front of you? So when it comes to whether someone thinks the afterlife or a deity is real, and they've tagged it in their brain as like, this is just a statement about the universe, and you and I can talk about Gandalf or whatever, and we both have tagged it as not real or some category like real within the context of fiction. It's really hard to break down what that is, and I think the productive way forward is to go, under what conditions does this belief, does this representation, under what conditions does this representation influence our behavior? Religious beliefs, religious representations in principle, influence people's behavior across most, if not all, domains. My TTRPG beliefs influence a subset of my behavior at a table on a Thursday night. Not even all of the behavior on a Thursday night. I might drink a beer, but my character might be a teetotaler. So there's already, it's governing speech acts in a collaborative context. So getting at belief and real is always so messy, because it comes down to really what you're interested in, as well as the fact we're not very good as scholars, as cognitive scientists and behavioralists, in understanding what is happening in the brain when something is considered real or not real. So,
Yes, and I'm going to say something controversial here myself,
okay.
which is we've been using the big P and small p analogy when it comes to big P prejudice and small p
Mhm.
prejudice. Small s science is how I would call psychology, as much as I love it.
Sure.
So easily the most controversial thing I've ever said in this chat. Um, but yes, the more we know, the more we realize we don't. The brain is still a massive mystery, and so many psychologists disagree with each other, whereas so many physicists don't, for example. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I know. I
Um,
know. I mean, I'll accept the small s science, I guess, at face value. But like, you talk to a climatologist and they run a model and it accounts for like 98% of the variance, and their predictions are amazing. Our data is so noisy. We're like, we explain 35% of the data. I mean, it's a messy, messy science, but like, maybe this is probably a little bit hyperbolic. There's very little as noisy and confusing in our known universe than ourselves. Even though we can operate in the world somehow, measuring it, quantifying it, generalizing it is really hard.
Amen. There you go. Two psychologists with inferiority complexes. There. Rowan, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed this chat. Thank you very much for your time.
No problem. Thanks so much, Steve.